He wrote me many letters. His handwriting was always legible, though slightly unsteady looking, and the lines often crept up toward the right-hand corner unless he wrote on ruled paper. His Y's and G's turned back to the left in a long loop under the line, and many of his capital letters began with a rounded loop like a bowling wire bent loosely around a stick. He mailed his letters regularly in government-stamped envelopes. His words were never crowded in against each other. The page gave the impression of someone taking pleasant time to express himself, without haste, but without unnecessary words. To find one of his stamp-embossed envelopes in the mail with my name or my column name on it and his return address in the corner came to be such a pleasure that I always regarded it as a good omen for that day. In January 1961 he wrote, "It is 3 o'clock in the morning. I cannot sleep tonight, so I thought to improve the time by writing to you. Some years ago I took a course in reading relative to the lives and habits of the race known as the Laplanders. No geography has ever been able to give the definite boundaries to Lapland. It is a region lying above the Arctic Circle. There are two types of Laplanders, the fishing Laplanders and the reindeer Laplanders. It might be of interest to Carol to learn they have school teachers but no schoolhouses and no licenses to teach." It was his last letter to me. He was beginning to feel always too weary to write, though he still enjoyed talking and retelling his stories. He was still cheerful, and a visit with him was still a pleasure. He was unable to attend Clara's funeral. In October of 1961, the last night we went to see him, which was slightly more than 2 weeks afterwards, and by this time he was in Jen Reep's kindly refuge, which had long ago been Calvin Fletcher's mansion. He was too weak and ill to be out of bed. We all talked. He told me again about Captain Slocum's trip around the world in a little fishing boat, and later on asked, "Do you know what is the greatest responsibility of the Supreme Court?" Holding a glass of water with a drinking tube in it for him, I said, "No," and he told me, "It is to make the decision after a meeting." Presently his third son, Mark, and his wife came, and we all stayed rather quietly a while. I had been sitting beside his bed, and I moved away to make room for them, and presently he asked, "Where is Rachel?" I was greatly touched and honored by this affectionate compliment. Mark and his wife went away presently, intending to come back later. Dick and I stayed on for a while. Presently Walter told his son Dick good night, and then said to me, "Well, Rachel, I guess that will be all." Reluctant to leave him, I asked, "Is there not one more thing I can do for you?" "Walter," he said, "no, I'm going to sleep now," so I kissed his forehead, and we came away. The next morning I learned it really had been, as the farmer probably had wished it to be, a dignified, loving, not at all mournful good night, a final good night. As soon as I learned this, my mind whirled back immediately, like a telephone dial released, to one colorful October afternoon, a year earlier, when Dick and I had taken Walter and Clara for a little drive in the country. We had stopped at a country grocery store, and Dick had gone in to get some ice cream cones. While we waited, Walter, in the front seat, turned around and asked me earnestly, "Do you know what is the greatest blessing on earth?" "Hogs," I suggested flippantly. His blue eyes were large and luminous behind his thick spectacles, and his voice was velvety with the conviction of his thinking. The fact that men can die and leave a place for a new generation to come into possession of the earth. A long-time farmer, loving the land and acquainted with it through success and defeat, he had learned some of its wisdom. How one harvest, departing, lays the foundation for the new one to follow, in earth's eternal pattern. The fullness of Maple Grove. There was nothing spectacular about the morning, it was just pleasant. A sunny, all but chilly October morning, and I was writing in the kitchen when Frank Bell phoned to ask Dick to come and help him with some calves. As I went up to the barn with the message, I was so taken by the charm of the morning, I wished I could bottle up some of it for winter enjoyment, or to send as a Christmas gift to a particularly loved friend. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just the farm on a sunny autumn morning. A wire-covered coop on a chunk outside the barn, containing a bantam hen and 11 baby chicks hatched from a nest she had stolen out in the hayloft. They serve a vestigial interest for Dick, who as a child used to raise chickens in town where he could not have cattle. He had a pen of bantams, and had them so circus-trained that when he stood in the doorway and cracked a whip, they jumped like acrobats from one perch to another. On the way to the barn, I had passed the walnut tree, from which now the huge walnuts are fallen and ready to gather. Because this year, for the first time, and goodness knows why, the kernels are good, filled out with plump, edible richness instead of dry, crinkled paper. Against the fence lay a 5-foot-tall, unpainted cross from a float that Reverend Mr. Ed Skirvin had built on one of the farm's wagons to go in the fall festival parade at Ellettsville a couple of weeks earlier. The float was reverent, with signs advocating a closer walk with God, and the Reverend Mr. Skirvin had worked hard up in the tool shed, sawing, hammering, and otherwise putting it together. It won a prize in the parade. Perhaps the bare cross released some of its dedicated feeling into the pleasant October air to make the day significant. Also, it was the birthday of my dear neighbor, Iris Stanger, but that was not unusual. She had one every year all her life. From the pond above the barn, the geese screamed their scorn, having observed me come up and search everywhere for Dick. This is not unusual either. Their continual scorn provides me with a great deal of amusement and prestige. The sunlight was warm looking against the old red of the painted barn and the old gray of the unpainted corn crib and tool shed, and against the mottled gray of the concrete slab silo. I went past this fruity-smelling tower, which was filled before Labor Day, and opened a month later, so great has been the drought effect on pasture. Sparrows were twittering, and chirping as gaily as if they had not heard of a coming presidential election, and if they hadn't, they were fortunate, although of course if Americans could not hold one every 4 years, they would also be twittering and chirping, or worse, chattering and swinging from trees, or still worse, accepting it quietly from deep under unmowed grass. The sunlit air had a sweet smell of October, coloring leaves, wood smoke, dew-washed morning, old warm boards, farm living, Nothing dramatic, nothing spectacular, but all overflowingly pleasant. And I had the same majestic joy the farm boy must have felt one morning when, 4 years old, he exulted, "Oh, there's so much things in my proudness. Every new thing is beautiful to me in the morning." This is a small farm of the species family farm, now generally considered becoming extinct in an era of mechanized farming and an overpopulous industrialized world. Little hope is held out for its survival. The question is thought to be not whether nor how, but merely how long, O Lord. The chief crop on this farm is feeder cattle. We keep around 167 cattle and raise corn, hay, and silage to feed them. The farm contains 239 acres, which is 109 more than we had when we first came here a little over 20 years ago. In those years, the pattern of farming has changed greatly in the nation and almost completely in this community. When we bought the first 130 acres here, the farmers were in the final polishing off stage of the changeover from horses to tractors. They were shortening the tongues of their old horse-drawn corn planters, manure spreaders, and mowing machines, so they could pull these with tractors. Later, they traded in the obsolete implements on new ones designed from the beginning for tractor power. Electricity, bathrooms, school consolidation, church remodeling, the second and third farm tractor on the farm, the second farm car, the hay baler, corn picker, grain combine, and field chopper have come since then. The neighborhood grapevine telephone that was maintained by neighbors who rang each other by code and paid a small switchboard fee was already competing with the Ellettsville Exchange and soon vanished from Maple Grove Farm homes. The fields on this farm were poor, badly fenced, eroded, and hungry. We also were poor, though not eroded or hungry. The fields were hilly, underlaid with limestone, subject to sinkholes. In every field was eloquent opportunity to demonstrate the value of soil and water conservation and tender, loving land care. In one field was a gully so deep I was afraid to drive the tractor close to the edge. Dick drove closer and got into it. Carl Stanger, plowing in his field across the road, had been watching and came with his tractor and pulled ours out. Dick plowed the gully full of topsoil from the field, and it went off in the first rain. But after the field was terraced, he filled it again, and it stayed healed. There was a small woods, about 20 acres, on the hilltop field. There were brushy fence rows and weedy corners to provide good wildlife cover. The house was run down, shabby, the neighbors cordial, observant, and each one as interesting as a new book. All around us were other small family farms, most of them occupied by members of a family that had owned the land a long time. The road ran between this farm, then known as Benny's Old Place, and the farms of two Stanger brothers, Clint's 127 acres and Bent's 109. Clint's married son Carr and his wife Iris, who has an AB degree in geology and taught high school geography before she married a farmer, lived with Clint and Eagle. Bent's married son Ira and Ira's wife, Monta, lived with Bent. It was the local pattern when a son married, the family made the back porch into a kitchen, built on another room or two, and shared the house with the young people. When the parents were old, there was someone in the house to care for them. By the time we moved here, Clint and Bent were both old men, both still taking an active part in the work on their farms. They were blue-eyed, friendly, liked to visit, and each had stories he liked to tell of the community's history and people. When they butchered their meat hogs, Dick butchered ours with them, and afterward went down to Clint's to help render lard in the big iron kettle in the wash-house. It takes a slow fire to render lard and makes a good time for a long, leisurely visit. Clint told us about his early days of farming. His mother's farm was small, so he and Bent had cropped other land around. They rented some land from old Tom Owens one spring and were eager to get at the plowing. Tom said it was too early and ground was too wet and would be cloddy if plowed then. Clint said, "I was on the road this morning and I saw other farmers plowing." Irritably, old Tom exclaimed, "One fool makes 40 more." Clint always laughed when he told that story. Slowly the farm we had bought began to become ours, and less slowly we became a part of the community. When our children were small and we were building up the farm, the community and the farm were our world. Farmers met often then at church or at the country school, at birthday parties in their home, at club meetings and church suppers, silo fillings, butcherings, hay balings, farm sales, and they visited each other in their homes more than they do now. When a woman was in the hospital with pneumonia or a new baby, the neighbors went to help. When an old man was ill for weeks in his terminal illness, the neighbors took turns sitting up with him through the nights. When a farmer met his neighbors in town, it was like meeting a fraternity brother. In those years of family life on this small farm, we went through all the customary experiences of getting acquainted with wildlife, weeds, all kinds of poultry and pets, worms, birds, moths, butterflies, frogs, eggs, tadpoles, and turtles, leaves, kites, and marbles, sleds, bicycles, ponies. We went through the era of cap guns and cowboys, bubblegum, school buses, and PTA, brownies, Girl Scouts, 4-H clubs, and future farmers. We studied teachers, farmers, ministers, and farm machinery. We had caroling parties, hayrides, school and church programs, radio, TV. The children camped in the backyard under a tent made of paper fertilizer sacks, saved their money, and bought a real tent. Spelunking, swimming, fishing, baseball gained momentum. We terraced the field and fertilized them, built new fences and farm ponds, remodeled an old barn, and hauled away the debris from the one that burned suddenly one rainy morning. People came to visit us. I began to write a newspaper column. Gradually, the farm fattened, the old house straightened its shoulders and lost some of its haggard look. The farm boy and girl outgrew the school bus and went to college. Having known and loved deep woods in my childhood, I soon discovered the joys of the little woods on the hilltop. On this farm, it gave us mushrooms, edible morels to eat, and beautiful scarlet caps, and orange shelf mushrooms, and others to look at. It gave us sassafras roots for tea, wild blackberries for pies, and jelly and philosophy, pawpaws for guests who like them, walnuts, glimpses of wildlife and flowers, snail shells, and a small demonstration of the way limestone breaks apart underground, swallows the soil above it, and makes a cave. It gave us places for solitude, for thinking, a place where we could go and sort out our values and lick our spiritual wounds clean. It offered a place to walk with congenial companions and gave us, finally, a wide viewpoint. The wooded hilltop is high above and behind the farm buildings, which on a farm are customarily referred to as the improvements. The fields in front of the woods were the first with which I established an affectionate rapport when we came to this farm. The understanding began that first spring, when I planted a little potato patch up there. Dick plowed a little space in the hillside field where the 3-year-old farm boy and I could plant all the sprouted potatoes. This always seems as much an act of mercy towards the potatoes as a hope of harvest from them. It took all afternoon up to time to get to supper. The boy was little and tired and went to sleep in my arms as I carried him down the hill. It was pleasant, an expression in miniature of a farmer's relationship with the earth. The hilltop field had an outgoing personality and spoke to each of us in different ways, to the same purposes. If I can just get back to the cornfield after a hard day in town, I feel all right, Dick said once. It was a good field in which to fly a kite, or ride a pony, or find an arrowhead. The blackberry patch in the woods was a good place for a farm woman to go if she wanted to talk aloud to herself. Nobody was likely to embarrass her by overhearing her in that hidden place, though actually why should it be more embarrassing to be caught talking to yourself than singing to yourself, which many women love to do? And certainly if you're not on speaking terms with yourself, you need to do something about it. In those early days when Dick drove through the woods on the tractor, he got off and set sticks beside the mushrooms so that we could all go back later and find them. And I have known the farm boy to go up to the hilltop field and simply run to work off a disappointment an 8-year-old was finding almost too great to bear. Benny built his house at the foot of the hill, I suppose, because the water was there, or perhaps because his parents' old brick house was already there, or perhaps because, as I soon discovered, a walk up to the hilltop was a pleasant escape into a broadened viewpoint. Carol discovered this early too. We went up on the hilltop together one afternoon. She was 4 years old and wore a little red and white checked bonnet my mother had just recently made for her. She put her small hand in mine, and I resisted a desire to squeeze it too happily. At the back step, Rose and her pup jumped up to follow. Beyond the first fence, we were joined by the tame ewe and her lamb, and as we went up the hill, we were 3 congenial mothers with our 3 youngest children. At the top of the hill, I sat down on a stone outcropping under the walnut tree, and Rose laid her head in my lap. Rose would leave her feed at any time for a caress. Carol threw off the bonnet, and she and the pup played ball with a green walnut. The ewe taught her lamb the glories of grass. Looking downhill, I saw how the view of the house was erased by the lofty maples surrounding it. I could see the barn and on out to the east field where the other barn had burned. I could see the road running uphill in front of our farm toward the small old white church, which was almost hidden by its gnarled hard maples and oaks. I could see Ralph Lewis's little stone block house, and across the road from it, across 6.5 miles of hills and valleys and dimpled farm fields, I could see the tops of the tallest towers in the university town, and smoke rising from some of the towers. Looking eastward, I could pick out the tops of pine trees at Jim Bell's tall house, and not far from it was the shine of sunlight on Clyde Naylor's new galvanized barn roof. The hedge east of the road shut off the sight of Monta's green-roofed small house and Clint's old one. But I could point out these places to Carol. I could show her Fred Dutton's farm and Alec Olmet's on the highest hilltop. We could see John and Leota Dunning's house, where just the day before I had been frying 30 slices of beautiful pink home-cured ham for silo fillers, and feeling flattered because John had told Leota, "Let Rachel fry the ham. I like the way she does it." From our hilltop we could not see the deep hollow we have to go through to get up to John's house on its hill. At the crossroads was Fanny's small white house with Fanny's weedless, flower-garnished garden. We could see as far as Earl's apple orchard beside his white barn and silo, and after that the woods back of us in our farm cut into our circular view and took out a wedge like a piece of pie. But in the gap we knew where John Fielder's neatly remodeled white house, and not far from it a new cedar red one built by his dairy farmer son-in-law, Emmett Baines. The pie ended just to the right, and we could see Russell Fife's cluster of neat buildings beyond our down-sloping clover meadow. In those days, for my column's sake, I never went any place without pencil and paper. The farm always inspired something to bring back. That day it inspired Carol. Presently, on top of that slope, where the sense of country life was deepest and richest, she suddenly stopped playing ball with the pup, stood up and stood still, looking down the hill, and made up a psalm of rejoicing, which she sang to herself, and I copied as much of it as I could. I like this home with green fields and horses and little woods. This home better do I like any homes. I like the ponies and the cows and the trees and the mountains and the car. I like the daddies and the little girls and the little boys and the red shoes and the tractor and the hay and myself. But no matter how much a farmer might love it, a farm of only 130 acres was too small. Farming was growing steadily more mechanized. The farmers took to the big machinery joyously. It was powerful, a flattering extension of their own strength. It was quick and efficient, but also expensive. Farming required a great deal of machinery, and to pay for the machinery required more land. Farmers on small acreages rented supplemental fields wherever they could, often several miles from home. On spring and summer mornings there was always some hardy early starter whipping along the Maple Grove Road on his tractor, going to some sharecropped corn or soybean field. Farming on the road, other farmers took town jobs, did their farming after job hours and on weekends, hired their hay customed baled. These were the sundowners, the moonlighters, the weekend farmers. Tractors now were equipped with lights, so that fields could be literally plowed and tended at night. Farm boys liked this kind of farming. There was an excitement about using powerful, loud-voiced machinery in the fields at night when the community was dark and people asleep. A kind of thrill about the way the tractor's headlights lit up the dark surroundings as the tractor swung around at the ends of rows. The larger level fields lent themselves best to this night farming. Dick's ancestors were farmers. As a boy he had been accustomed to a larger farm, although his father did not live on a farm. With only 130 acres now, he felt boxed in. From time to time we looked for larger farms in the communities. By the time Carol was a freshman at DePaul and Joe was a senior at Purdue, we discovered Monta and Ira had decided to sell their farm and move closer to their married daughter. The possibility of being able to buy land adjoining ours had never occurred to us. Bent had built the house on his farm. Ira, an only child, was born there. Monta had lived in it since she married Ira 43 years earlier. I couldn't imagine the community without them living there. It was at a meeting of the Women's Council in the remodeled church that I heard this news. "Are you really going to sell your farm?" I exclaimed incredulously to Monta. "Well," she turned her forthright dark brown eyes on me. "He asked us, and Ira made him a price, and if he takes us up we'll have to." The man's offer was an opening wedge, but he was reluctant to pay Ira's price of $200 an acre, which was fortunate for us. We figured that since Ira's farm touched ours, the east road running between our fields and his cornfield, buying it would save us the cost of moving, and we could afford to spend the saving for the land. Moving is expensive, farmers say. 3 moves is as bad as a burnout. Ira's house is a small one-story dwelling of no particular style, covered with imitation brick siding. After his father's death, Ira had cut down on his farming operation and given his full working time to carpentering. He belonged to the union and worked for contractors. He brings home his money from town and puts it into the farm, and we can't tell where it's gone. Monta had told me sometime earlier. It was the usual farm comment. She helped out by raising and selling strawberries and chickens. She kept a big flock of white Wyandottes and sold dressed chickens and eggs. Once a week she went to town to work for one of her friends at housework. She enjoyed this as an outing. She also enjoyed her strawberrying, gardening, flowers, care of the chickens, her church work, guest, family gatherings, and her housework. She liked color, activity, perfume, TV, singing, sewing. I've had bouquets and vegetables, strawberries, zinnia seeds, good time, advice, news, and deep comfort from Monta's house. And although we were happy to have their land, we regretted losing them as close neighbors. Ira never complained when he came home from a day's work in town, and Monta wanted him to take her someplace. He is little and bald, has a big car, and likes to drive it. He is companionable, likes a visit with lots of laughter. He enjoys telling jokes and news, and even if the joke isn't very funny, he has a good time telling it, which entertains his listener, and the more the listener laughs, for whatever reason, the more Ira laughs also. The upshot is everybody can have a great deal of pleasure from a small joke. This is typical farm thrift. Ira never complained when Monta asked him to make home improvements, such as pine paneling in the living room cabinets in the kitchen, or a bathroom in one corner of a spare bedroom. In return, she never complained when he came in with mud on his boots. "It's his home too," she said fondly, "and I'm just glad for him to get in." Monta's hen house and brooder house were halfway between the house and barn, and at night when some predator, raccoon, skunk, or fox, raided the hen house, she could hear the outcry of the hens. She had lost several hens to one invader one spring, and so decided to stay up all night and keep watch. "I heard roosters crow on every farm in this neighborhood," she told me later. "Joe, your bantams crow every hour on the hour." The moritor did not come on the nights she stayed up to watch. It came again just as bedtime one night later. Ira was in the bathtub taking a bath. Monta, sitting on the bed, had just taken off her shoes when the chickens began their uproar. "Ira, that thing's back here after the chickens," she called, and ran out without stopping to put on her shoes. Ira got out of the bathtub, dripping, grabbed his gun, and followed. The invader had got away by the time they got to the hen house. As she walked back to the house, stepped gingerly on the cindery path, Monta noticed Ira for the first time. "Why, you're barefooted too," she exclaimed. On the December evening when we went down to discuss buying their farm, Monta was pleased. She said, it'll almost be like keeping it in the family, and you have a boy to help you too. Of course we lost our boy, but maybe he wouldn't have wanted to stay on the farm. So many of 'em don't now, seems like." When she said that, I remembered the time some years earlier when we were walking together up to the church on our week to clean it, and she told me about their boy. He was less than 6 months old, a big, healthy baby, when he suddenly became ill, and died before even the doctor realized his condition. "I have seen his little grave in the Maple Grove Cemetery," Monta said earnestly. "I walked up here every day that summer. If it hadn't been, I was afraid somebody would see me, it being so close to the road and all. I'd have dug him up. I just wanted to see him again so bad." We bought the farm in December, and Ira gave Dick immediate possession of the barn and sheds to store machinery and feed in, and the fields to put steers on. Monta and Ira planned to hold a sale in March, disposing of their hay, grain, machinery, and stock, and some household things they wouldn't have room for in the new place. In June, before the strawberries were gone, they moved. Dreading it, I went down that morning to tell Monta good-bye. To my relief, she was already gone. The house was clean. The pink polka-dotted curtains were clean at the kitchen windows. Ira and 3 movers were pitting their frail humanity against the long freezer, which was full of packages of meat, fruit, and vegetables Monta had put into it. They had taken off the lid to reduce its weight. They were busy, and I didn't want to waste their time at $6.50 to $8 an hour for movers, so I came on home. I could call Monta and tell her goodbye over the phone, which would be easier, or I could see her when she came back to pick the last of her garden and take up starts of iris and lilac for the new place. "There's eyeball-bustin' work to be done wherever you look," said Dick, staring out one rain-studded morning. "Nevertheless, it seems peaceful this morning." It is characteristic of a farm to be able to put on this peaceful look in each of its greatly contrasting seasons. Winter is not my favorite time, but there are winter scenes I remember as the very portrait of peace. One in particular, not long before. It was snowing in the morning, the kind of snow God probably had in mind when he first created snow and later created courier and Ives and painters and photographers and riders to try to capture it, and little wild animals to make tracks across it, writing their diaries for that day. Snow was falling softly as if from a coarse sifter being turned from very high above the earth. It had been going on a long time. The leafless trees were whitened, weeds and tangled raspberry canes in the garden had become a great heap of foamy white lace. I looked through the back porch window, where snow lay on the ledge, making a white frame for a loving picture of sparrows outside in the east yard. They were energetic, cheerful, and busy. A group of them hopped along the swept walk, eating crumbs. One sparrow created a miniature snowstorm when he alighted on a delicate peach twig. The twig quivered under his weight, the sparrow rose, snowflakes sparkled and fell on the snow-topped woodpile under the peach tree. Under the big swamp maple in the east, Lot the gray geese and white pilgrim ganders gathered silently. During winter nights they sleep in the open-faced tool-shed, and often in the night they think of new expressions of scorn and at once utter them. We are the watchdogs, we geese, we saved Rome. That peaceful morning they walked on the clinging moist snow and were still. They looked thoughtful, as if contemplating the sense of peace that pervaded the whole farmscape. Snow was also falling on the red and white cattle in the east lot, and they were unconcerned about it. Some were standing up, others lying in the snow as comfortably as if on lush summer grass. Snow falling through the sunless morning air dimmed it to pale gray and made all the cattle look dark. In December nights, when anybody opened a door or walked through the yard, the cattle bawled as if they wanted to call a summit talk. But on that snowy morning they were as quiet as painted cattle in a winter canvas. A sense of deep, total peace filled the morning, a peace so profound it was almost disturbing. I realized to my astonishment that if total peace ever actually befell the whole world all at one time, it would be the most spectacular sight mankind has ever seen. Nobody would be able to believe it, or perhaps even to survive it.